For the longest time in the video game industry, one of the biggest selling points for any home console would be a high quality conversion of a popular arcade game, or preferably a whole bunch of them. The appeal should be easy enough to fathom. Having a game you'd enjoyed enough to pump all your spare change into, accessible on demand whenever you felt like playing it on your home game system, was going to save you a ton of money in the long run. And as consoles became more powerful, these conversions would begin to more closely resemble their arcade counterparts. There have been some remarkable ports of coin-op classics during the 8 and 16-bit home console eras. Things like Strider on the Sega Genesis or Street Fighter II on the Super Nintendo spring to mind. But usually, they couldn't hope to completely recapture the sights and sounds of the originals. There was a time though when arcade games didn't sell themselves on the strength of fancy visuals and gimmicks, instead relying on accessibility and simple gameplay concepts to draw a crowd. And yes, there was a demand for those games to be ported to consoles of their era as well, whether the hardware was really up to the job or not. Hence, Namco's 1979 coin-op Galaxian would become one of those early video games that would enjoy many conversions to different systems, including this typically chunky looking port for the Atari 2600. Where today's console games are all about telling epic stories, leveling up characters, and devoting weeks to finishing them, the appeal of something like Galaxian is much more immediate. When you power up an Atari 2600, whatever you slot into it, you're going to be playing for points and high scores. My personal opinion is that the best games from this period are the ones that require you to do more than mindlessly stab the fire button to earn them, and Galaxian serves as a good example of a mechanically sound game in that respect. It's the kind of thing you can dive straight into, with the basics of its gameplay being very straightforward. You control a spaceship rooted to the bottom of the screen, and the object of the game is to destroy waves of alien bugs that conveniently arrange themselves in orderly rows in the top half of the screen. These guys seem to be following the exact same invasion plan as the critters in Taito's Space Invaders, which makes me wonder what the deal was with late 70s video game aliens and their evident preoccupation with marching in line. Trust me, if planet Earth ever does get invaded by aliens, we're going to be just fine. They may be technologically superior, but our armed forces know how to think outside of the box in ways these guys can only dream of. Speaking of Space Invaders, you could comfortably describe Galaxian as an evolution of that game. The similarities between the two are fairly obvious, except there are no bunkers for you to protect or take cover behind in this one, and these aliens are actually much more aggressive. Almost immediately, they'll launch themselves at you in kamikaze bombing runs, taking potshots at you as they go. You'll learn very quickly that Galaxian doesn't play fair. Those attacking bugs will throw a handful of shots at you as they descend, while you're limited to having one shot on screen at a time. Once you've pressed the fire button, you can't fire again until your last shot either destroys a bug or flies off the top of the screen, and actually hitting anything can be tricky. The bugs weave about slowly in formation and zigzag at speed when they're attacking you directly, so it takes a bit of skill to actually land a shot. Skillful shooting is amply rewarded though. Taking out an attacking alien as it dashes down screen towards you will earn you more points than hitting one in formation. Sometimes they'll attack in groups as well. The white aliens at the very top of the screen will occasionally come at you with a couple of red ones in tow, and if you can shoot them down in a specific order, hitting the red bugs first and the white one last, you'll score a juicy points bonus. These finer details of Galaxian's gameplay are enough to encourage you to play tactically for higher scores, and they encourage risk-taking as well. Wiping out stationary aliens might advance you through the game's stages a lot faster, but it'll mean there are less aliens on screen to harass you with strafing runs, which means fewer opportunities to score extra points. So you simply won't score big if you play that way. Playing this game well means playing chicken with oncoming aliens and pulling off some tricky shooting. Once you've wiped out one wave of evil aliens, you'll move on to the next, where the pace of the game moves incrementally faster and the bugs attack more frequently. Rinse and repeat until you inevitably die, which will happen. This game was designed to eat spare change after all. Galaxian holds up pretty well on the 2600. It controls well and retains the feel of its arcade counterpart to a large extent. In fact, it's only when you hold the two up alongside each other to make a direct comparison that the concessions made to squeezing it onto an Atari cartridge become obvious. Whenever I look back at a game on an older system like one of Atari's early home consoles, I've got to admit that it's sometimes an effort to keep my view of things realistic. It's not fair to adversely judge games for those systems just because the consoles themselves aren't the most advanced by today's standards. That would be missing the point of reviewing them. But there's a flip side to consider when you're talking about conversions of genuine arcade classics, irrespective of the platform they appear on. I've always been fascinated by the historic disparity in terms of technical capability that existed between proprietary arcade game hardware and home gaming systems. It's a disconnect that grew shorter and shorter with each progressive generation of new, more powerful home computers and consoles. But in the early days, even when arcade games were at their simplest in terms of presentation, that difference between what you'd see in an arcade and what you'd get from a home conversion was real. Galaxian is one of those games that, by virtue of its design, is recognisable on pretty much whatever platform it appears. On the 2600, the game sounds very different, which I'm actually grateful for, because the incessant warbling and bleeping of Namco's arcade cabinet is something I've always found rather annoying. Visually, it's not as colourful or dynamic either, but realistically, that's only to be expected. To give a little context here, the original 1979 arcade machine was considered something of a major step forward for video game technology in terms of its graphics handling. I can remember playing one in a hotel on holiday as a kid, and being mesmerised by its multicoloured sprites and the pretty, endlessly scrolling starfield in the background. It all looks very basic by today's standards, of course, but evidently it was still enough of a challenge to recreate those visuals on home consoles in the early 80s. Inevitably, Atari's plucky little wood-grain console can't replicate those detailed graphics, although it does put in a pretty good effort. That starfield I'd so admired as a kid is completely absent, and the player-controlled spaceship is rendered in solid white instead of having coloured parts. Attacking enemies are still multicoloured though, at least until they begin their bombing runs, whereupon the console needs to render them in a single colour. But these are merely cosmetic concerns. The only compromise that does kind of affect things is that, by nature of the 2600's super low native output resolution and the aspect ratio of domestic television screens way back, the play area is a bit more claustrophobic. It lacks the more open feel of the arcade machine's taller screen. This means there's still a way to go for anybody looking for a console version of Galaxian that recreates the original 100% accurately. But rest assured, while that more spacious feel might be missing, everything else about this version of the game feels authentic. I've got to be completely honest and say that, hand on heart, I'm not a huge fan of Galaxian. It's not that I dislike it, it's just that, for me, Namco's direct sequel, the infamous Galaga, always felt more energetic and involving. Galaxian's still worth a look though. In fact, as part of the series it would eventually form alongside Galaga and the lesser known Gaplus, it's an interesting game to play from a standpoint of seeing how certain aspects of it would be developed later. This isn't the best home console conversion of it I've seen, and come to think of it, if you do a bit of poking around in the Atari 2600 homebrew scene, it's debatably not even the best version of it on this console. But it's still a respectable attempt to bring Namco's arcade game into the living room, retaining its pick-up and play approachability without compromising the spirit of the original. And in my book, that's how you define a good conversion.